Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Murder in the Morning. I have a family story for you guys today. Clearly, you know the title. It's called A Mother's Love. Got my coffee. It's about 7:30 right now, and I couldn't think of a better time to jump into some murder. So, I got the information for today's story from a Forensic Files article titled The Unthinkable Murderpedia article about Christopher Porco, and an ABC article titled Amid the Carnage, A Mother's Love. Inspiration for my title. Alright, where do we start? So this story takes us to Bethlehem, New York, a city of roughly 40,000 people. For those who don't know the state of New York, Bethlehem borders Albany, the state's capital. Bethlehem is your typical suburban city with high-quality schools, freshly cut grass, and a peaceful living for the most part. Not to mention the fact it's entirely surrounded by towering mountains and glassy lakes, such as the Adirondack Forest and Lake Placid. While spending some time on the city's website, they mentioned having a low crime rate, as if the foreshadowing couldn't be more on the nose, because as both you and I know, amid this beautiful scenery awaits a horrific discovery. Alright, let's talk about the crime scene a little bit. On November 15, 2004, Peter Porco, a 52-year-old law clerk, failed to show up to work that day. According to ForensicFilesNow.com, it was his coworker Michael H. that eventually went to go and check on him. This poor man, I can never imagine how instantaneously his morning had flipped upside down. Michael was the first on the crime scene that day. As no one answered the door, he peeked through a window and spotted Peter splayed out across the floor in a pool of his own blood. Michael called the police immediately, and before long, an officer had orders to enter the home, and the worst was confirmed. Peter Porco was dead. But to the officers at the crime scene, their day was only beginning. Upon further search of the residence, Joan Porco, Peter's wife, had been found in the couple's bedroom. Now, I'll let you off the hook right away. Joan does survive like an absolute badass. So listen to this. Reportedly, when the officers found her, she was conscious, right? But Joan had been attacked with an axe 3 times. 3 times. The article I read stated, and I quote, but only 3 times? I'm sorry, that's plenty for me. Joan's jaw had been broken, her left eye had been mutilated, and the other side of her face had even been demolished with enough force to expose part of her brain. Now remember when I said she was still conscious? That simply amazes me. I remember passing out after barely fracturing my collarbone a few years ago, and this woman is literally missing half of her face, and she's still alive and breathing. People amaze me. After being found, Joan was then rushed to the hospital immediately. Back in the entryway, Peter hadn't been so lucky. The medical examiner had found many head wounds, much more than 3, consistent with that of his wife's. Later, it was confirmed he'd been struck at least 16 times with the axe. Vastly more than 3. I still think 3 or 16 is plenty, but I digress. This axe was later found in the couple's bedroom next to the blood-soaked bed where Joan had been found. Honestly, I wonder how the responding officers had felt that day, seeing as this type of crime was basically unheard of in the neighborhood. And to say the least, it had rocked the small town of Bethlehem, and the people needed and wanted answers. Many times when investigating a homicide, the officers are starting from square one. They're out canvassing, grinding over the small details, or waiting for DNA to be tested, collected, and passed on down the chain. Hardly ever, it seems, do investigators get an immediate suspect directly from the victim's mouth. Let's take a quick little step back to the night of the actual attack. As lucky as Joan was to be breathing, the detectives were lucky enough to ask her a few questions about her attack before she was rushed to the hospital. When asked by Detective Christopher Bowdish, or Bowdish, not really sure on that, I'm going to go with Bowdish. This detective had asked her if her attacker was a family member. Yeah, I have no idea how to pronounce half these words, so just bear with me. He had asked her if her attacker was a family member. I guess that's kind of how you get straight to the point, huh? Joan was able to nod yes. with her husband Peter as a victim himself. That left her 2 sons, John the eldest and Christopher, as the other 2 family members, or suspects if you believe Joan's word right off the bat here. Somehow, as the paramedics continued to tend to Joan's injuries, Detective Bodish was able to obtain one more crucial piece of information. He had asked Joan if Christopher, the youngest son, was responsible, and what the investigator received was an all-important head nod of yes. Now, apparently, he had also asked about John, the elder brother, too, but Joan had shook her head, and that's not as important here, I guess. So, as great as this lead was, it still needed to be investigated and confirmed. No jury will convict on this piece of evidence alone, or not even evidence, just hearsay. So, the police investigators were quick to confirm that the older brother, John, had nothing to do with the horrific crime. It turned out he was a naval officer stationed at a military base during the murder. This left Chris as the only remaining family member. Chris was also relatively easy to locate, but unlike his brother, he was much harder to rule out as a suspect. So he was able to be reached at the University of Rochester, roughly 230 miles to the west. However, it turns out he had already been notified by a reporter of the Times-Union in the area about the events the night previous. She had contacted Chris himself while attempting to reach his roommate in regard to the murder and attempted murder. Somehow, which I wasn't able to find, but this reporter was able to basically, she knew about the murder before anyone would have contacted Chris himself about the murder of his own father and attack on the mother. So she was actually the one to alert Chris of this murder, and then he promptly returned to Bethlehem, where police proceeded to question him there. All right. So Chris told police that during the night of the murder, on November 14th, he had simply gone back to the dorm lounge to sleep for the night at the University of Rochester. I thought it was odd that he said dorm lounge rather than just a dorm room or dorm, where I think most people tend to sleep. Clearly, Chris needed a little bit of harder look into here. Now, there were a couple of other suspects that I will briefly cover. One man who lost a custody case against Peter's law firm had sworn revenge. There isn't a whole lot more information on this other than the fact that he was unable to provide a solid alibi. But with that being said, there was no other indication of his involvement or possible leads for the police to follow. I also remember reading that Peter Porco had a connection to the mafia. But again, there was no objective evidence to suggest that this was a mafia-related attack. It was kind of just rumors spread. With nowhere else to turn, the police quickly focused their investigation on Chris Porco, lacking a solid alibi and the fact that Joan, his own mother, had ID'd him the night of the attack. Chris was easily their prime suspect. All right, so I want to take a quick peek into the unattractive and short history of Christopher Porco. Unfortunately, there isn't too much known about his younger years or how his childhood may have played into this story, but the articles I did read focus heavily on the years leading up to the Porco's attack. So Chris had been reported throughout college for multiple burglaries, most notably of his own parents' house. Now, this next crime isn't the most terrible, but I find it a little bit odd. Chris had stolen a laptop from his parents' home, right, and decided to sell it on eBay. However, when it did sell, he never sent it in the mail and pocketed the money, like an absolute dick. After the customer complained to him, he proceeded to send emails to those customers that he just scammed, right, posing as his older brother, saying that he, Chris, the seller, had died, which is why they didn't receive the laptop or a refund. I just wanted to put that in there because I think that's a huge indication of the kind of person he is. Just scummy. Just scummy, you know? So among the burglaries and illegal eBaying, he was also found to forge illegal documents in regard to his tuition. He had failed out of the University of Rochester, after which his parents sent a scathing email threatening essentially to cut him off. Chris then proceeded to acquire readmittance via a forged transcript from a community college. So, failed out, forged a fake transcript saying he was still good enough, and then got back in. So this all came to a head when Christopher took out a $30,000 loan, apparently for tuition's sake, and forged his father's signature as the cosigner. This isn't really something you want out of your children, and it seems that due to all of Chris's behavior here, turmoil had started to arise among the family, most notably between Chris and his father, Peter. The tension was real, right? But his parents hadn't given up on him, though. A few emails taken as evidence showed that they were always caring parents, even in the face of him burglarizing their own home. The following quote is a bit long, but I believe it's relevant towards this case. So, Peter Porco, in this email, he said, and I quote, "I want you to know that if you abuse my credit again, I will be forced to file forgery affidavits in order to disclaim liability, and that applies to the Citibank college loan if you attempt to reactivate it or to use my credit to obtain any other loan." He then continued on to say, "We may be disappointed in you, but your mother and I still love you and care about your future." Which I think many of us have probably heard. But it's true, they do still love us, right? So, with all that being said, and with no other great suspects, investigators have plenty of suspicion and now motive to continue pursuing Chris as the lead suspect. Plus, the conversation between Joan and Detective Bodish the night of the crimes, as I continue to mention. So let's dive into this investigation and into the puzzle of it all. Chris's alibi was a simple one, remember? Allegedly, he had stayed the night alone, the key word being alone here, in the university lounge rather than in his bed. He essentially left a story unable to be corroborated by his then roommates. So the big question the police needed to answer was Chris really 3 hours sleeping away peacefully in that lounge? Or at home committing heinous acts? They seemed to think it was the latter. Now they just needed some hard evidence to prove so. So let me try to lay this out as best as I can. So the Porco's house is approximately 232 miles from Rochester. For Chris to pull this off, he would have clearly needed to drive. Nobody's that fast on foot, I don't think. The police were sure that he traveled the 3 hours or 230 miles to his parents' home, brutally attacked his mother, murdered his father, and then turned around and sped back to Rochester. I took some time to look this up on Google Maps and check possible routes myself. I found only 2 ways, and one being a stretch, for Chris to drive there and back by morning. If Chris were to avoid tollways, it would have taken 4.5 hours each way. Even though it's about the same length, you're just taking slower, you're taking the back roads, right? So that would have allowed Chris with 2 hours and 10 minutes less time, to be exact, to do what he did that night. And I assume the investigators also realized this very quickly, which is why they focused on the tollway route, which seemed to be the most viable of the two. As many people around the country know all too well, tolls can be a pain in the ass. I myself, being born and raised in Minnesota, where these do not exist, tolls are a little bit of a new thing to me out here in the East Coast. And yes, I hate them, but I guess they do serve a purpose for when it comes to stopping crime. Yay. So for current tollway travelers, purchasing an Easy Pass can save you time, money, over the long run, right? But this pass also contains and sends information each time you pass a station. So at the time, Chris was driving a yellow 2-door Jeep, and when checking with the Easy Pass system, the police were unable to find any data on the Jeep during that night in question. When Chris's car was later searched, this pass was found on the floor, presumably to avoid tollway detection. I feel like I'm saying tollways a lot right now, so I'm sorry about that. But fortunately for the detectives, these stations have more information at their disposal, such as real-life human beings positioned along the cash-only lanes. When speaking with detectives, these attendants confirmed seeing a yellow Jeep on the night of the murder, with Chris in the driver's seat. Boom! Now, this is a great lead, but they still needed more. Right now, all they've proven is that Chris was out and about that night, essentially. Unlike so many other cases I listen to, watch, or read about, this case seems to keep hitting green lights, as opposed to roadblocks. As their luck would have it, the Rochester campus had some of their own cameras at their disposal running that night, and they were recording. You and I both know how often that is not the case. So these cameras happened to catch Chris's Jeep leaving campus roughly at 10:30 p.m. and returning 10 hours later around 8:30 a.m. the next morning. This would have allowed Chris plenty of time to drive back home to commit insane murder and then speed back to campus. Finally, another witness, a neighbor of the Porcos, admitted to seeing Chris's yellow Jeep in the parents' driveway the night of the attack. This neighbor, along with a tollway attendant's confirmation of Chris and his yellow Jeep, plus the campus cameras, have now given the investigators a full working timeline. And still, without any other set of suspects coming into play, Chris is in hot water. I've never said hot water before, so let's just forget that I said that. Okay. I'm not 35 yet. All right, so this is the police theory. Let's set it up here. Christopher Porco is now some $50,000 in debt after that massive loan and previous tuition debt, according to school and bank records, which is essentially all owed to his father due to those forgeries. And unlike normal people in debt, Chris has not set out to get a job and pay it back. Instead, he set out to get his family's life insurance policy, which was valued around $1 million at the time. Nice round number. That's funny. Just a million flat. But there's only one way to get a life insurance policy, right? And that's if someone dies. So this theory actually lines up with Christopher's actions after the attacks. Shortly after, he sought financial advice, saying to an advisor that he would be coming into a lot of money shortly. Which, yes, this might be true had he been found innocent at the end of it all, but I'm sure we can see that he was quite guilty. Investigators, too, found it odd that he wasn't focused on his mother's health or his father's death, but rather on the money he stood to gain from it all. Bad luck, buddy. Bad luck. Okay, here we are at the trial finally. So the trial took place in July of 2006, roughly 2 years later, with the chief assistant district attorney heading up the prosecution. The prosecution, even in light of everything that had been discovered, still had very minimal DNA evidence other than a single through ticket from the tollway, from that cash-only lane, right? Now, this part is a little bit out of the blue to me. It just kind of jumped out of the article randomly. But the reason that there was no DNA found at the scene, it was theorized by the prosecution that Chris was wearing scrubs from his previous jobs and experience of, quote, cleaning up surgical procedures. Ew. First of all, not to hate on anyone that actually has this job, but the fact that Chris, a murderer, has this job gives me shivers. Way worse than the graveyard shift, right? So apparently no DNA was left at the scene because of these scrubs he was allegedly wearing. Chris was then proven a liar by the prosecution. 9 of his frat brothers took the stand and denied seeing him sleeping in the Rochester dorm lounge or sleeping anywhere that night. This is then when the Porco's neighbor, the tollway attendants, as well as the campus surveillance tapes were also brought to the jury's attention. One more consequential piece of evidence was the Porco's own home security system. So the important thing is not what it did catch, but more so what it hadn't. The security system had actually been turned off and then smashed in the wee hours of the morning. So police theorized that, and I quote, Christopher smashed the alarm box in a failed attempt to mask the fact that someone had punched the correct code in, end quote. So the police essentially here are saying that Chris tried to make it look like this was a break-in gone bad, but they could see right through that, because if you smash the alarm without punching the code in, it's still going to go off. And according to John Porco, the older brother, only a handful of people knew the code for the alarm, limited only to immediate family members. The defense, on the other hand, had a much briefer argument. They brought up 2 possibly striking positions on their behalf. For one, Chris's attorney mentioned the fact that the prosecution had no physical evidence linking Chris to the crime. No DNA, fingerprints, or anything else. Side note, if that's your parents' home and they found no DNA, like, are you never visiting? I feel like you'd find something, right? Or maybe they just didn't find anything on the murder weapon. I don't know. Where was I? Oh, yeah. So no DNA, fingerprints, or anything else. As a prosecutor, not that I am one, but if I were, that's what would have worried me the most. Subsequently, the defense also argued that Chris's guilt, quote, was a foregone conclusion, end quote. In fact, it seemed that many people were angered by the fact that the detectives were so heavily focused on Chris. But then again, who can blame them? When all other leads dry out, everything points to this kid. I mean, come on. All right. So what happened? The jury didn't take very long to deliberate after the trial ended. On August 10, 2006, Chris was found guilty of second-degree murder and attempted murder. I was a little confused as to why the first charge was only second degree, but I'm no expert. Maybe they just didn't have enough to prove premeditation. LOL. Like I said, I'm no expert. Maybe I should look that up. Later that year, in December, the judge sentenced him to 25 years to life with a minimum of 50 years served. So, I just kind of want to mention something here that I find very interesting. In fact, it's sort of the whole reason I chose to do this case and why I titled this episode A Mother's Love, in addition to the ABC article already having that title. Remember before when I mentioned that Joan, the mother, had identified him as the attacker on the night of, right? Well, after she started to heal and began to speak out publicly in response to those crimes, guess what? She stood behind her son. Even after everything was laid out, the judge's sentencing, along with her own previous admission, Joan loved him through everything. She went as far as to go to court with him and testified for the defense. Like, this is so hard to wrap my head around, honestly. Because obviously, well, let me just say, Joan is an angel in this situation, whether Chris was guilty or not. I'm going to put that out there. And she was so strong to stand by him and believe in him as a mother. I mean, I feel like it'd be hard not to. Your own kid, right? I don't have any, but I feel like that'd be hard. But to me, from an outside perspective and fully believing in his guilt, I feel disgusted by this. Not only did he betray his family by slaying his father and attacking his mother, he then continued his evil reign by letting his poor mother sit there and defend him after he tried to fucking kill her. I don't know. Who knows, though? Because maybe deep down she really did know that Chris was the killer, but after the loss of her husband and essentially now her son, that may have just been too much to bear. Like, you hear every once in a while of someone dying from a broken heart, and I couldn't stop thinking about that throughout researching this case. Not of someone actually dying from a broken heart, but rather of Joan Porco trying to avoid the breaking of her own heart. That's deep. All right, let me just wrap this up. Where do we stand today? Chris Porco is still in jail as of the latest article I could find, I would hope. And apparently his mother is still doing well. Good for you, Joan. So his plot to kill them both failed. His plot to get rich quickly failed. And he's a failure. There aren't many updates as to Chris's life behind bars. He seems to be remaining quiet for the most part, except for one funny little detail. You know, Lifetime, the Christmas movie company channel, whatever they are, they did a movie roughly based on the murder of the investigation. And this idiot Chris tried to file a lawsuit against Lifetime in retaliation. But thankfully it was dismissed and went nowhere. So nice try, buddy. Last but not least, I have a little, well, I was going to say treat, but that's the wrong word. Something extra. So I didn't talk too much about the actual crime scene because I wanted to save this bit for the end. I mentioned previously that one of Peter's coworkers had gone to check on him and found him lying in a pool of his own blood in the kitchen, right? So this was not where he was attacked at all. Peter was actually struck all 16 times with the axe right next to his wife in bed. But after the attack, the crime scene would show that he had gotten up, put on clothes, so like there was blood under the clothes and they seeped out, right? He had walked all the way outside to grab a newspaper, realized he locked himself outside as the door shut behind him, and then he found a spare key to let himself back into the kitchen where he finally died of blood loss. And when I say blood loss, I mean blood loss. So I took this directly from ABC News. Couldn't say it any better myself. There was blood, quote, all over the appliances, countertops, walls, and floors of the kitchen. He's covered in blood. Saturated in blood. End quote. Saturated in blood? I've never heard that used before, and it makes me tingle. It doesn't mean like that's a lot of blood. It means like this, like basically you jumped into a swimming pool full of blood with your clothes on. That's beyond. That's too much. I read that and my mind just exploded with questions, right? How? Why? what WTF? But apparently, an injury like this can cause damage to the brain's neocortex, which I didn't know what that was, so I had to look it up. But that controls your reasoning function. And apparently, when Peter Porco was struck in the head with an axe, it controlled his reasoning function, so he became a brief real-life zombie as he was bleeding out all over the house, which is absolutely crazy, but not unheard of. So if that's something that interests you, I highly recommend Googling other reports of this happening. Anywho, that's all then. I hope you guys have a great day. Drink your coffee. It's good for you. Bye-bye.